last left off, we were talking about the design process, and we spent a lot of time exploring goals articulation. We haven't started to explore much about the landscape yet. And so the next step in this process is what we call our site analysis and assessment. But what we'll often just call it is our A&A. The analysis we could imagine as being our what, and the assessment becomes the so what. Observation and interpretation. It's hard to make sense of a place when you're seeing all of those pieces and not able to understand them as part of the whole. And so there's a couple of different ways we can go about our A&A, one of which would be what we'll call like non-judgmental observation. We're observing what is, but we're not jumping to conclusions in terms of like what are the implications of that. So we notice that there's a wet spot, right? And so what follows with that what is, well, what are some potential interpretations of what does that wet spot imply? So we've got some impermeable layer or some like dense hard pan that's not allowing the water to drain. Clay, spring, could be shallow bedrock, right? So these are all possible interpretations of what's going on. But it's really important that we don't jump to conclusions right away, because just in the same way that having a function or having a form already expressed in our mind without thinking about like what functions that provides, it clouds our judgment and it precludes our ability to recognize other potential implications of that observation. Sometimes we'll call that childlike observation, meaning that you're like you're seeing the tree species that are present, and you're looking at the slope, and you're recognizing where there are wet spots and dry spots, and you're recognizing that it's hot here, and wow, I feel a breeze, and look at that building over there. But all of that information in and of itself can kind of cloud your ability to see those bigger patterns sometimes. And so what we're going to lay out and practice is a process that we call thematic observation, meaning that we're breaking the landscape up into a series of layers. And the tool we're using for that is the scale of permanence. Can anyone venture a definition of the scale of permanence? What's it all about? It's a continuum of like features or processes on a given place that range from those things that are most permanent or least that we have the least leverage to change, as compared to those things that we are most amenable to change, that we have the most ability to modify. If we arrive in a place we've never been, what's the most fixed aspect of that place? What can we change least as individuals? The climate, right? And so as we start to do our analysis and assessment, we can start to look on our scale of permanence checklist here and then begin to quantify and characterize different aspects of the climate of the site. And so that might include things like the hardiness zone, the plant hardiness zone. What is that? It's a way of quantifying a place, characterizing a place based on the coldest winter temperature, and it's broken up into increments of 10 degrees Fahrenheit. So zone 4 describes where the coldest temperature they reach is between minus 20 and minus 30 Fahrenheit. Zone 5 is minus 10 to minus 20. Zone 6 is 0 to minus 10, right? So we can look up data like that and start to find out like what are the extremes around which we want to plan. We can look at things like the annual precipitation, as well as we want to know not just like what's the annual average, but how is it distributed throughout the course of the year. We want to look at like how brittle is this landscape, or non-brittle is it? How evenly distributed is the precipitation? What might be another important thing to consider when it comes to precipitation? The extremes, yes, exactly. Like what's the 100-year storm event that's happened here? What's the most rain we've ever seen in a condensed period of time? And what's the longest we've gone without rain? Those extremes offer really valuable filters for design, because it's around that we can start to think about how much water may we want to store in order to make sure that we're able to weather a seasonal drought, or how large should our overflow be in order to ensure, on a pond, in order to ensure that we have the ability to handle extreme storm surge events. In reality, like the way that we start to chronicle this is as a layer of data typically. So it's a lot of information. It's not necessarily represented graphically on our map. So what's next after climate? What's like the next most fixed piece? Topography. Yeah, so the topography or the landform. The nature of ridges and valleys. We're looking at like where we are in the watershed. Are we high up on a ridge? Are we like low in a valley? What's the depth to bedrock? What is the bedrock? What is the superficial geology like? Elevation, depth to the high water table or depth to the water table, those sort of features. We're on a piece of trace paper generally, and this is what we're going to do in practice in class, is that we're going to go out and one group is going to start to map out the topography of the site. We do our landform analysis, and then we look to the next characteristic of the landscape, that is water. And that's going to include things like wet spots and dry spots and the watershed of a building. It's a pattern of drainage. It's an area of land that drains to a common body of water. And so, like the simplest watershed divide that we could imagine is that of the peak of a gable roof that's sending water in one direction or the other. So we can start mapping out like watershed divides in the landscape, the wet spots. Where's the leach field? Where's the well? Is there a well? Is there a spring that's developed? And as we're doing that, we're both, again, looking at the what, so we're kind of describing what are these features, and then what are the implications of those features. The technique that we're using is what we call the process of data overlay. It's essentially like old school GIS. So essentially we're just creating these layers of data. Water, our next feature in that scale of permanence, followed by access and circulation. Where is the existing road? In what condition is it in? What's the surface? What's the nature of the surface? And what shape is it? Where are there footpaths versus wheelbarrow paths versus paths only accessible by four-wheel drive or tractor? So we're also thinking about like material flows and where do we store and stockpile different materials? How do people and resources move throughout the landscape? In this case, again, totally different layer of trace paper on our map. It's kind of arguable in terms of where it goes, but we'd look at legal issues, property setbacks, rights of way, zoning ordinances, and these actually can be pretty significant restrictions or constraints. Next, we look at vegetation and wildlife. If we're talking like a quarter acre or less in a suburban or urban context, we probably want to map out every individual tree and shrub that's on the property. Whereas when we're talking about 170 acres, right, we're talking like broad brush strokes, like plant communities. You know, on a large scale, it's really valuable for us to be able to blur our eyes and look at those big picture patterns instead of getting bogged down by all the detail that's in the field. Microclimates. So where are there hot spots, cold spots? Where does the snow stick around late into the season? Where does it melt first? This is going to also relate to like the aspect of our site, which could fit into any number of these categories, including landform, potentially climate, but are we on like a southeast facing slope? Is it facing north, right? Are we in the bottom of a valley where we're prone to like cold air drainage and frost pockets? Are we like high in the landscape and get blasted by wind? Next comes buildings and infrastructure. We may decide to do a floor plan of an existing building. We may do cross sections and elevation and look at the way that different rooms relate within the building itself. We probably want to observe the foundation. We can look at the nature of the roof as well, or the condition of the roof. And then infrastructure would include all of the services that are supporting the activities of the building in this case. Natural gas, propane, fuel oil, electricity, cable, internet, where we store our wood, our firewood perhaps, that could be a piece of infrastructure. So this is really our map exploring like the built landscape. Zones of use. So that's one big piece of zones of use is like how often do we visit different elements within the landscape? How often do those elements require visitation from us? It's really a measure of like the intensity of usage in the landscape. Those areas that we modify most extremely, which are generally the places right around our primary locus of inhabitation. So like the zone 0 in the permaculture landscape is the place where activity originates. It's our house, it could be an office, and then we radiate out into increasing orders of magnitude generally, or increasing scale as we get closer to zone 5, which is like the unmanaged wild aspect of the landscape, as compared to zone 1, which is like the highly manicured, highly managed elements that require like daily or several times a day require visitation from us. Next on our scale of permanence, we've got soils, but really it's not so much soils but rather soil fertility and management. Because soils really aren't something we can easily change in terms of like the texture of the soil. It's pretty hard to change if you've got a silty clay or a sandy loam, but we can have dramatic impact on the fertility of our site as well as the ways in which we manage the site. There's potentially a lot we can do to transform the nature of our soils, the fertility of our soils, and the way we manage and steward our soils. And so I think partly soils is so low on this scale of permanence just to help remind us how hopeful this all can be, that good management can have dramatic impacts on the health and fertility of our landscape. And last, we've got aesthetics and the experience of the place. We could be thinking about sounds and smells that we might experience from coming in from off-site. It could be a privacy sector. It's also just the feeling that we get when we're in certain places, the sacred spots that really inspire you to be there and make you feel really grounded and that you know are kind of like off limits in terms of development, is very subjective, but at the same time it means that it's most amenable to our ability to modify and change it. And it's probably one of the most important features in that it helps direct where we're drawn to devote energy. There's maybe two other layers that I haven't included here that I think are important to mention. And it's hard to say exactly where they fit, but history, right? Like historical land use patterns is something that has large implications in terms of like what's possible in a place and what challenges or resources do we inherit in the future. And sometimes, unfortunately, often like connected to history would be any toxicity, old dump sites on an old farm, or perhaps our relationship to existing, landfills or brownfields or other contaminated sites. This is the type of data that we want to be cognizant of and not ignore, which also relates to where we are in the watershed. Essentially, what we're looking at doing, again, is trying to develop the character and the personality of the place by working our way through these individual layers with the intention of reconnecting all these pieces and telling the story of the site. But then what we ultimately are seeking to do is find the patterns that tell us about this place. And so we synthesize all of that data, and the next step in our design process then becomes the A&A summary or synthesis map. And in reality, it's often not just a single map. It may be that it's one map with an overlay or two. It may be that we get into specific detail on certain features here that we found to be particularly important. But what we want to keep in mind here is that, again, it's not about the pieces. It's about how they connect and relate to one another. We're looking at what are the most important features of the climate here and the landform and water and access. Consider how do they connect and how do they relate to how do they create this synthesized character of the place where we are that starts to point us towards the solutions that we begin to explore as we approach design. And that's the target for the balance of our site analysis process. Some of that information that you don't readily have access to, you might never be able to find, like the history of the place could be a challenge. The climate is fairly easy to gather some of that data for, but things like wind patterns might take time, or it might take you talking to people who've been in the area for quite some time. But it's a process, right? And we've really only explored the first half of this process, and the process itself is iterative in that it's never done. So we come up with a design, we implement it, and then we get feedback, and our design evolves as a result of that. So I would say find that balance between where you feel comfortable enough to act, not overwhelmed by not knowing what you don't know, but also aware of where there are gaps in your knowledge base. And I think that's what this scale of permanence helps us do, is just recognize what it is that we don't already know and where we might want to gather more information. Mm-hmm. If we spend a good amount of time doing this on the ground work up front, that the design does emerge from that process.